My name is David Constant. I am professor of classics at New York University, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker in our Emerging Scholars presentation series, Carlos Mariscal de Gante Centeno. This series is organized and hosted by NYU's Center for Ancient Studies, and I would like to thank Matthew Santarocco and Maura Pollard for their support of this series. We are particularly excited to engage approaches to the study of the ancient world that incorporate non-traditional materials and methods. Carlos will present a brief overview of his thesis, Lecturas Mexicanas de Virgilio en el contexto hispanoamericano del siglo XX. That is to say, as you've seen, Mexican readings of Virgil in the Hispano-American context of the 20th century. Afterwards, we'll proceed to a brief discussion, questions and answers of Carlos's work and its implications. So now let me turn the floor or the video room over to Carlos.
Thanks for the presentation. I would like also to say that I'm so grateful to NYU Center for Ancient Studies for having selected me as one of his emerging scholars, and to say that I'm deeply grateful to Professor David Constant for his support during this process, the preparation of this presentation and conversation, and also for his kindness to me and my work. I really appreciate it, and let's hope this goes well and you find it interesting. So first, I would like to introduce my topic, the topic of my dissertation. As I will discuss later, it is an investigation on Virgilian readings within the Latin American context of the 20th century Mexico. It is carried out following mainly some parameters of the classical reception studies, along with specific concepts from translation studies and literary historiography. These three different, even complementary points of view enabled me to reconstruct the concerns of different Mexican authors and a Spanish one, as we will see, about Virgil and his works. So starting with my topic, my dissertation deals with the issue of Virgilian readings in the 20th century Mexican literature. To study it, I divided it into three parts: historiography, that is to say, the histories of Latin literature published in Mexico within this period; translations; and literary recreation, which is the most plentiful and interesting one. Within this first section, the only sample I have found is the Historia de la Literatura Latina. So let me share my screen. This is the book I'm talking about, the Historia de la Literatura Latina 1964 by Agustín Millares Carlo, a literature handbook published in the Fondo de Cultura Económica in Mexico, along with the translation of Cecil Maurice Boura, Ancient Greek Literature, translated by Alfonso Reyes, one of the most important authors included in my work. Regarding this text, I have the chance to study how, on the one hand, Virgil is discussed following some 19th century ideas, such as his originality and his comparison with Homer, considered to be superior to him. On the other hand, I have researched on the author, Millares Carlo, who was himself an exiled professor in Mexico because of the Spanish Civil War and played an important role in creating cultural and academic initiatives like the Bibliotheca Scriptorum Graecorum et Romanorum Mexicana, the bilingual collection of classical texts founded at the UNAM within this period. The second section of my dissertation is dedicated to translations and includes the study of two versions of Virgilian works along this period, the ones by Aurelio Espinosa Polit and Rubén Bonifaz Nuño. These two represent two different ways of approaching Virgilian texts. The first one, by Espinosa Polit, a Jesuit classicist priest from Ecuador, is more poetical, creative in its intention of transporting beauty from Latin to Spanish. He uses different equivalences to get it: meter, syntax, literary figures that conform a new literary work in Spanish, a new Virgilian poem based on Virgil's texts. On the other hand, Bonifaz Nuño's version tries to reproduce literally Virgil's Latin to Spanish in order to help Mexican students learn and understand the ancient texts. He tried a rhythmical translation. He called it hexametro bárbaro, barbaric hexameter, where not just the text, but also the rhythm was imitated in Spanish. In the recreation section, the last one, I studied how Mexican writers from this period read, in the sense given to that term by classical reception studies, Virgil and his work to actualize anew what Virgil has meant within his own ideological, aesthetic, and political context. Thus, we will find different Virgils depending on these individual features. The literary recreation of Virgil, the last part of the dissertation, is, as I said, the biggest and, in my view, the richest one. I have gathered 9 Mexican writers in my work who somehow gave a modern view of his poems. There would be a lot to be discussed here, but I think it is at least possible to name the main authors and organize them historically. Within the period of the so-called Mexican Revolution, there were 3 essential readers of Virgil: Ramón López Velarde, the one on the left, who compared Mexican history with the Roman one by comparing, for example, Julius Caesar with Cuauhtémoc, the nephew and son-in-law of Moctezuma, and the last resistant to the Spanish conquest in the 16th century. He did it by quoting the spurious poem to the Aeneid and other Virgilian and Horatian passages. Alfonso Reyes, the one on the center, is probably the most important and devoted reader of Virgil within this period, whose works place himself and the hard times he suffered during the Mexican Revolution as some sort of Virgilian voyage. José Vasconcelos, a wonderful writer and apologetic politician, attacked modern implications of Virgilian ideas and aesthetics, such as the justification of the conquest or the pragmatic imperialism, and thought that Virgilian poems were boring and dry, following, for example, Joris Karol Huysmans' decadent aesthetics. There were also modern ideological responses to Virgil after the revolution. One was carried out by a group of Catholic intellectuals gathered around the Editorial Jus, the publishing house of a conservative movement that, following an ancient tradition, tried to present Virgil as a herald of Christianity. The only woman I have encountered for this dissertation is Rosario Castellanos. She, on the other side, opposed Virgil's narration from the 4th book of the Aeneid regarding the reasons why Aeneas left Dido, transforming the story in an allegation against sexism, represented by the Trojan hero, a cheater and responsible for Dido's death. Besides, Carlos Montemayor, another Mexican writer, wrote a critical work on this occasion against Virgil's justification of conquest and social order, but saving his aesthetics and rewriting some Virgilian passages, such as the arma virumque cano or the expression fato profugus, considering the inhabitant of our modern cities as a prófugo de sí, a fugitive of himself. Finally, 2 authors must be mentioned, for they mainly recreated Virgilian verses from an aesthetic point of view. Fernando del Paso, on the one hand, created a modern Palinurus in his own novel Palinurus of Mexico, 1976, following Cyril Sconolly's The Unquiet Grave, 1944, and the Joycean narrative techniques and his ironical Latin quotes. On the other hand, José Emilio Pacheco, the last author I have paid attention to, followed Jorge Luis Borges' aesthetic approach to Virgil to write some modern poems with key Virgilian verses, as the Hippalagies, Tacitae per amica silentia lunae, Aeneid 2, 2055, and Perumbras obscuram, as Virgil described Dido in Aeneid 6, 452-453, or detaching sunt lacrimae rerum et mentem mortalia tangunt, Aeneid 1, 462. In my view, this kind of topic is tremendously productive, because first, it is dedicated to gather, organize, and study the dialogue established between ancient writers, Virgil in this specific case, and modern works and contexts such as the 20th century and the 20th century Mexican literature, to be more specific. This is important and original itself, because we are talking about something that had not been studied for this purpose before. So indeed, it is interesting because we can watch how modern writers have reshaped Virgilian texts, and productive also because we can get and study texts that are not common in our field. It allows us to focus on authors and texts which at first would seem far from our interest, but that are meaningful for those who are interested in what classics have meant over the centuries. So by researching on these topics, we can add new perspectives to our field that can enrich and expand it. The main purpose here is to obtain modern versions of Latin passages, genres, and ideas that decide important features of modern literature and also contribute to see Virgil in different ways. We are dealing with new and invigorating recreations, readings of texts that have been read, commented on, and recreated for centuries, and even today maintain their power of attraction and inspiration. These modern authors have actualized anew what Virgil means and could mean in other possible contexts, and with their own concerns. It is a suggestive paradox if we think about it for a while. Virgil is already attractive enough to produce compelling modern responses to him that make us see his text in a specific way and think about features that could have not been noticed before. Looking back to the specific authors I discussed in my dissertation, for example, Alfonso Reyes, who was an amazing prose writer, poet, and playwright, he conceived of his own life following Virgilian parameters. His early Virgilian works are quite ironical and satirical, but when the Mexican Revolution started, he had to suffer himself the meaning of the war, of the destruction of his own city, the exile, and the loss of beloved people like his own father. Years after that, and after his exile in Spain and France, he would write about these terrible years following again Virgilian poetry. For him, Virgil meant the possibility of building a new and more liberal Mexico, but also the ability to understand the immense grief involved in the upbuilding of new nations. So, classical reception studies are themselves an impressive field of knowledge, fertile for those who, like me, are starting their academic career. Also, more specifically, this sort of studies has a rich atmosphere to be explored in Latin American literature, and specifically in the one from the 20th century. This period, the 20th century, and context, Mexican literature, could seem far from classics, but they are not. It is a matter of trying to understand modern aesthetics and politics, and then seek where, how, and what for these authors are reshaping classical works. There is a lot to be done here, as you can notice. Thus, we are able to gather a wide variety of authors, aesthetics, and ideologies that are appropriating Virgil and other authors to produce new versions of them. That is what, in sum, I value the most of my research on this sort of topics. Naturally, this topic does not end with the defense of a dissertation, as I did some weeks ago. Of course, there are other authors that are interesting for my research, and I will be working on them afterwards. I've not included them for different reasons. They could not be as important or original in their work and as the ones I chose. In addition, I'm sure that I will encounter new authors because Mexican literature is even today so rich and powerful that there could be writers, novelists, poets that are not commonly known today and arise in the next years. But it is not just the authors I could include in my research. There are other Latin American literatures that are as rich and original as the Mexican, and can surely offer a new field to investigate in the future using this same methodology. So we have a strong methodology and rich potential objects of study ahead. Thank you so much for your attention. That is my presentation.
Thank you so much, Carlos. That was absolutely fascinating. I would love to discuss this with you at length, but let me begin with one question, and a personal one.
Okay.
It's often said that reception differs from the classical tradition, as we used to call it, because reception is a two-way street. People speak of the influence of modern writers on Virgil, rather than only the way around. And so my first question is, how has your study of the Mexican and wider Hispanic reception of Virgil changed your understanding of Virgil himself, if it has done so in any way?
Yes. Of course, it did. And it did so in different ways, I would say. First of all, I studied Mexican literature, but I am a Spaniard. So for me, it was interesting also to get in touch with Mexican literature before my study of its relationship with Virgil. So for me, it was quite interesting to discover how main authors see their own history, the historical moment they were living, or their own concerns about following Virgil. And there are a wide variety of authors who did it so. And that was interesting because I wouldn't expect to be so various my work in this field before I started to do it. And there are other better said, there are specific points of the history of Mexico and of Mexican aesthetics that are particularly interesting for this field. For example, the revolution, an historical shock, like this struggle, this suffering, this grief, seen from a Virgilian perspective, like the second book of the Aeneid. And this was amazing because we are talking about like a century, as the 20th century, that could seem far from from classics, and it is not, or it is not in these authors. So yes, it has changed me because it has made me enjoy, as a reader of this text, their great quality, and also think about questions I haven't thought about before, like, for example, Virgil, if Virgil could be like a defensor or a predecessor for sexism, for example, in Rosario Castellanos' works, for example, like Aeneas leaving Dido is a sexist man and a cheater and responsible for her own death. And I hadn't thought about it in from this point of view, because I have always trusted Virgil, and Virgil said that Aeneas left Dido because he had an important mission. Okay, and now in the 20th century, there is a writer, a woman, who says, no, Virgil is also a cheater, and Virgil is justifying sexism. And it's like, okay, wait, let me think about it. And yes, I hadn't, so it, to say it briefly, it has made me think about important features of Virgilian works that I hadn't noticed before.
Yes, I understand that. Almost a century ago, Robert Graves wrote a polemical essay called Virgil the Propagandist.
Yeah.
And he saw him as nothing more than a henchman of the regime, defending its imperialism. And there was a reaction to this, but especially under the group called, sometimes known as the Harvard School, those pessimistic readings of Virgil. one of my former colleagues, Michael Putnam, was a major figure in this, to read Virgil as against the grain, seeing
Mhm.
him as saying other things. And so I imagine that you've struggled with this same tension in
Yeah.
relating to Virgil.
Yes, I think it requires a complex thinking, because yes, Virgil, of course, he was justifying August and wars and imperialism, but at the same time, he is still a great poet, and you can enjoy and think with his hexameters. And so we have just to at first sight, it could seem like contradictory, but yes, we need to deal with it. For example, Alfonso Reyes, it's interesting because in his Discurso por Virgilio, this discourse for Virgil, he says something similar to the Harvard School, to say, okay, Virgil is the poet of the power, the poet of the social order, the established social order, the establishment, but he's also the poet of the grief, of the suffering, of the lost, of the loss, and yes, and he's the poet of both sides at the same time.
Now, let me come now to the other end of the reception scheme. You are a born Spaniard, and you've come to Mexico, and you've concentrated primarily on the Mexican reception of Virgil. In what way, if in any way, did you find this study changed or enriched your view of Mexico? Coming to Mexico from the center, from the mother country,
Yes.
coming to the colony,
Yeah.
the New Spain,
The New Spain,
as
yeah.
it once was called, and now in
Yeah.
Mexico, and you see through these lenses, these rich lenses, was there any particular way in which you felt yourself learning something very special about the Mexican world you now chose to be part of?
Yes, I would say one feature of what you are talking about. For example, that classics here, classics came here as part of the Spanish legacy, with all the implications and problems that means. Because yes, something as rich and interesting for us, like classics and reading classics and poetry, also came here with the conquest. And this is a problem for some people, because it puts you in a difficult situation sometimes. Not me, but there are other people who find it difficult to assume, or even contradictory, or difficult to assume and to enjoy classics by themselves, because classics are also attached to the conquest. So, for example, I hadn't noticed before, because in Spain we don't have so recent our context. Nobody in Spain would say, okay, I don't want to read Virgil because we are Iberian and we are not Romans, and this is not like a point here. But in Mexico, in fact, it is now already.
Probably know that we have a very energetic discussion of the role of classics going on in the United States today. Yeah. To the extent that some members of our own profession have regarded classics as inherently colonialistic, inherently elitist, inherently, some would go so far as to say racist, a term that it's very hard to apply to antiquity, where it's not entirely clear what concept, if any, they had of race. But nevertheless, this has opened an energetic conversation. And one of the things I found fascinating about your thesis is to show exactly how rich and subtle a use of Virgil a modern literary figure's giants can make. I presume that they didn't go back to Virgil with a desire to rehabilitate him. That wasn't their motive. They went back to Virgil because they found some special inspiration there that was not yet exhausted, and that could contribute to our reading of our own times. Is there any one particular episode or passage or treatment that most particularly changed your own perception, both of whether of Virgil or of how Virgil could be used? Maybe it was the sexist business, maybe it was Dido's curse, or was there some other that in particular influenced you?
Yes, yeah, all of them, of course, but there is one in particular, which were so like widely imitated by different authors, which is this passage "Sunt lacrimae rerum et mentem mortalia tangunt" from the first book of the Aeneid, which was translated and recreated by Alfonso Reyes in different works, but also by Pedro Enrique Zureña, a friend of him who was also part of this Círculo del Ateneo, del Ateneo de la Juventud, a special group of Mexican writers during the first decades of the 20th century, but also in the last decades of the 20th century by, for example, Jorge Luis Borges in Argentina, and also José Emilio Pacheco here in Mexico. He who was an important writer and poet, he also recreated this verse in different poems. So this verse, which appears in the Aeneid, gathering all the suffering and grief of the fall of Troy. It is also used here to sing the suffering and the fall of Mexico during the Mexican Revolution, but also by José Emilio Pacheco following Borges' aesthetics. He wrote a poem, for example, called The Library of Babel, Borges, and also Pacheco creates he calls it the Hotel of Babel, where one can find all the suffering on all the difficult moments of his own life. And he ends this brief poem in prose with lacrimae rerum, and he says, the tears that are in all things. He translates this just lacrimae rerum, these two words, not the whole verse.
Right.
So that's amazing. And by the way, I was reading a book not related to Mexican literature, but I was reading a book called The Lost by Daniel Mendelsohn, who I think is a professor there in New York, about the history of his family, his Jewish family in the east of Europe, and he uses the same verse to talk about the loss of his relatives by the Nazis. So this is a verse for the 20th century, for all the struggles and wars that happened during this period. Is a verse particularly touching, I think, for authors that are talking about these kind of moments or events.
Yeah, very much appreciate that description. I just remind some of our audience that phrase, "there are tears for things," such a simple phrase, is something that Aeneas reflects on when he's looking at sculptures, reliefs of the war in Troy, from which he is an exile because Troy has been destroyed, and he seems to see behind the sculptures and the fact that his story is known in foreign lands because he's now in Dido's Carthage. He sees the possibility of human sympathy across different nations. What doesn't occur to him is that the temple in which these sculptures are hanging is a temple of Juno, who is his arch enemy, who is precisely the person who is punishing him and making him suffer. And that complication in Virgil, that sense that somehow, even across the hostility of the gods themselves, there can be some bond around our susceptibility to suffering, around the pain and the harm that can be done to us, and can be, and is in fact, a harbinger of Dido's very sympathetic and loving welcome of Aeneas and his poor refugees. This gives us a lot to think about in our own time of exiles and refugees and loss and places that have been destroyed and perhaps can never be recovered. So I can imagine that all of these elements went in as well to your complex reading. I suppose I have one last question, which is about where you will turn now. You already mentioned that you're going to look at some future writers. Are you going to expand to the Latin American continent in general, or focus more on interactions between Spain and the New World? What, where are you moved to go next?
Yes, I would like to do both. For example, I find another interesting field in translations, for example, and in translations studied from both sides of the ocean, because there are as you said, ways from Spain to Mexico, and from Mexico to Spain, from Argentina to Spain from Argentina. Yeah, these two directions create a special field to be studied, because there are mutual implications, and it is interesting to study Virgil's translations from this perspective. I would like to do it. I hope soon. And also, yes, work on different authors, Mexican authors, and yes, try to expand it to other Latin American countries or literatures. But this is as I have experience with Mexico, this is a hard work, because you need first to get into the literature of the country. And we are talking about countries whose literature in the 20th century is so rich. Let's think about Argentina, Colombia. I would like to do it and to create a big work on Virgil in Latin America in the 20th century, but I think that that will come after some years. So yes, I hope so.
At some point, even extend to that other great colonized country in the New World, the United States. And
Yeah.
I've often felt that we should have much more sympathy and interaction with one another in precisely that respect.
Yeah, in the States, there are already some interesting works. For example, Tsiolkovsky, his works on Virgil and the Moderns, this canonical text is amazing. But there are some other authors who are already to be explored in the States also. So yes, it could be that it will take me longer, I think.
Thank you very much, Carlos. It has been a pleasure talking to you, a pleasure getting to know your work, and an honor for NYU to have you in this series of emerging scholars. Thanks so much.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much, and thank you to the NYU.